some other language, but was actually English language. This is a translation. Hey, or listen. We have heard of the glory of the Shakespeareans in the old days, the kings of tribes, how noble princes showed great courage. This is a translation of a quotation from Beowulf in the original language, which was the Old English. And I'm sure you will admit it doesn't really look like English at all. Well, Shakespeare did not write in Middle English. Middle English is the language of Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the Guyrian poet, and Mallory. In Chaucer, you will find something like this. This is Middle English. Well, it looks more like English. We read it oft and find it, you write, and this lacks well its weight. Lays that been in happening, been ye found of anything. From Sir Ophiu. This is Middle English. This was before the time of Shakespeare. This Shakespeare wrote in early modern English. Early modern English was not very different from modern English. So this during the time of Shakespeare, the predominant language was the early modern English. It was after the time of Shakespeare that we had what we now call the modern English. And so, don't be surprised when you see certain words in Shakespeare's writings that are quite different from what we now have as the modern English, because Shakespeare wrote in early modern English. So you will hear things like thou, thee, thine. Yes, because that was the language of the time. Have you checked the King James version of the Bible? You will realize that the language in that version of the Bible is quite the same as the language that Shakespeare writes in his plays. And this is because the translation of the King James version of the Bible was done around that time. So I'm sure if you begin to love the language of Shakespeare, you will love the language of the King James version of the Bible. It was a mix of old and very new. The language of Shakespeare was a mixture of the Old English, that is the English just before Shakespeare's time, and the English that was then developing. You will find rural and urban words and images. He used quite a lot of them. His language then was understandable by the lowest peasant, that is the ordinary people, the lowest people, and the highest noble. So the high people understood his language, the lowly people also understood his language. He was able to communicate both to those of the higher class and those of the lower class as well. How many words did Shakespeare use? Well, 30,000 words, quite a number. How many words do we use today? Well, just about 6,000 to 15,000. Well, probably just about half of the words used by Shakespeare. Shakespeare loved the language, and his love of the language can be seen in his writings. How he is able to make use of language in Shakespeare's time. Everyone indeed loved the English language. It was first the language of the ordinary people, but the nobles also began to love it. Prior to this, English language had mostly been used by the common people. The big people were more interested in Latin. So Latin eventually lost popularity because the majority were the ordinary people, and they were using the English language. So more and more people were actually using the English language and the Latin. Till eventually Latin got out of use, as some would say. Latin died away. English has survived, and it has evolved into the modern English. There were no rigid grammar rules or punctuation keys or spelling in those times. The language was then evolving. The language was evolving, and every day new words were being made up. If any situation crops up, new words will be formed. English language today continues to grow like that. New words keep getting formed virtually every day. Anytime a new event comes up, anytime a new thing comes up, English finds a way to push the new words into the language. This is one of the things that have made English more popular all over the world. Shakespeare's language reflects this freedom and experimentation. Shakespeare wrote mostly in a iambic pentameter. What is an iambic pentameter? We will learn a lot about this later. That is, if you have not already done that in your previous lessons. It is a sound pattern. The iambic pentameter is a sound pattern mostly used in poetry. Shakespeare actually uses both prose and poetry in his drama. In Shakespearean drama, you will find both prose and poetry. An iamb is made up of one unaccented or unstressed syllable followed by a stressed or accented syllable. So one unstressed followed by one stress. One unstressed followed by one stress. It's like a heartbeat. Ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. That's how the iamb works. Now, 5 ba-booms, that is 5 iambs in a row, make one line of iambic pentameter. Pent means 5. So if you have 5 iambs, we will call it an iambic pentameter. If you have only one iamb, we will say it's an iamb or an iambus. If you have 2 iambs, we will have an iambic dimeter. If you have 3 iambs, we will have an iambic trimeter. 4 iambs will be an iambic tetrameter. And 5 iambs will give you an iambic pentameter. So Shakespeare often used 5 iambs on a line in his poetry and even in his plays, sometimes in his plays. An example: he went to town today to buy a car. He went to town today to buy a car. He went to town today to buy a car. Lovely, isn't it? We will see more later. Or, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. As in one of his plays, The Merchant of Venice, where he says, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad. But why go to all the trouble to write iambic pentameters? Well, using iambic pentameter kept things moving in the play like a drum beat. Ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. So the play, you could hear rhythm in Shakespeare's play as the characters talk. It also made the words and play more interesting. Imagine a play in which sometimes you could see some rhythm in the characters' words. It also helped the actors remember their lines like a song. The characters kept their lines. It is easier to memorize something that's in the form of a song. So it helped the actors to memorize their words as they were in a iambic pentameter. It was easier to put rhythm to it. It was easier to make music out of the lines. In Shakespeare's time, you only had one copy of a play, and after you wrote it for the acting company, you no longer owned it. Scripts were thrown out when they were no longer wanted or needed. So if I wrote my play, after I had given it to the theater company to perform it, it belonged to the theater company. Only my name would be on it as the writer. No copies of Shakespeare's plays in his own handwriting have survived. The only known evidence of anything in his handwriting is his signature on the play Sir Thomas More that Shakespeare might have written. Quartos. In those days, plays were mostly published in quartos. A quarto is a small book of published plays. It's a small book of published plays, and they were called quartos. The first published works of Shakespeare vary considerably. There were quite some differences. They vary considerably from what we have today. Scholars believe that these are faulty versions, calling them bad quartos. Probably people copied them but did not copy them well, so they were seen as bad quartos. Now this is the works of William Shakespeare. Observe the spelling of works. But this was not a problem in those times. Containing all his comedies, histories, and observe the spelling of histories and tragedies. So they were made up of comedies, histories, and tragedies, truly set forth according to their first original. Now this was one of the originals of the complete works of Shakespeare. The first full collection of Shakespeare's works was published in 1623, 7 years after his death. Indeed, his full works were not completely published until 7 years after his death. It was called First Folio. That was the first compilation. It contained 36 plays compiled by John Herring and Henry Condell, who were friends and fellow actors of Shakespeare. Let's now take a look at the Elizabethan theatrical conventions. Acting. In those days, that is in the time of Elizabeth, actors were all men. Young boys, usually aged between 12 and 14, played the female parts. They were considered shareholders. The actors were considered shareholders and owned stock or shares in the play texts, costumes, and props. Their pay depended on admission sales. Actors only had about 3 weeks to practice a new play. In 1 week, the troops may perform 6 different plays, as many as 4,000 lines. Theatrical convention is a suspension of reality. Now, anytime we enter the theater for that moment of the performance of the play, we suspend reality, because whatever we are going to do is not real. We call it a performance. It's a suspension of reality. Remember, in the theater of Shakespeare, there was no electricity. Women were forbidden to act on stage. There was minimal contemporary costumes. There was minimal scenery, and it is these things that controlled the dialogue. During those times, too, of course, they made good use of soliloquy and asides. These were the types of speech that were predominant in the theater of the time. Now, the audience of the time actually loved to be scared. And so plays would talk about blood, and the use of supernatural. Still on the theatrical conventions of Shakespeare's theatre. The theatre of Shakespeare made good use of disguises and mistaken identity. The last speaker was usually the highest in rank in tragedies. There were multiple methods in tragedies, and in comedies you will often find at the end multiple marriages. Now Shakespeare says, all the worlds are staged, and all the men and women mere players. So, let's dramatize Shakespeare. Let's keep Shakespeare alive through his plays and poetry as we play our parts as players on this stage. On Shakespeare's epitaph, this is what's there. Good friends, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the bones enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bone. This is where we end